The birth of Jesus seems like a big deal in human history that's been celebrated all around the world.
Yeah, there's a lot more to Christmas than just Santa and gift giving. And in fact, the birth of Jesus, leading to the start of Christianity, has had a tremendous impact on Western civilization.
Really? What kind of impacts are we talking about? I thought Christianity has always just been part of Western civilization.
That's not exactly true. Christianity actually sprang into existence in the 1st century AD, after the death of Jesus in the Middle East in Jerusalem. Jesus' teachings and values were radically different from the surrounding Roman and Jewish society, and some modern values, like the worth of a human life and the importance of education, can be traced back to social reforms brought about by early Christians based on Jesus' teachings. Here's a clip that summarizes some of those impacts.
What good is Christianity? Have the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth made the world a better place? Or is Christianity positively harmful, a menace to civilization, a threat to human survival, and the principal enemy of moral progress in the world? What does the historical record tell us? The world that Jesus was born into considered women socially and intellectually inferior. They were not permitted the same rights, privileges, and freedoms that men enjoyed. And in Jewish culture, women were not permitted to speak in public, especially in the presence of a man, which also meant she couldn't testify in a court of law. But the way Jesus treated women was revolutionary. Not only did he stand against the anti-female culture of his day, he also set a new standard of kindness, compassion, and respect. As a result, the early church included women, honored women, supported widows, and gave women a freedom and dignity previously unknown in any culture. In India, where widows were burned on their husbands' funeral pyres, it was the Christians who were largely responsible for getting this practice banned. In China, young girls were intentionally crippled by binding their feet. Again, it was the influence of the Christians that led the Chinese government to outlaw this practice. It's no exaggeration to say the birth of Jesus was the turning point in the history of woman. In the ancient Greek and Roman world, children were property. Babies, especially little girls, were often killed immediately after birth or abandoned to die of exposure. And what we call child abuse today was considered normal back then. Then Jesus appeared, and children became people. Christians opposed all forms of child abuse, rescued babies who had been left out to die, often adopting them into their own families. They taught the world to value and care for the youngest members of society. Christians were the first people in history to systematically fight against slavery. Slavery in the West was abolished largely because of the efforts of Christians like William Wilberforce in England and the abolitionists in America, most of whom were Christian ministers. These followers of Jesus reasoned that since we are all created equal in the eyes of God, no one has the right to rule another without their consent. Christianity provides the moral foundation not only of anti-slavery, but also of democracy. The freedom and opportunity enjoyed in the U.S. and other democracies is built on ideas furnished by the Judeo-Christian worldview. The understanding that man is sinful underscores the need for checks and balances and 3 branches of government. The idea of being governed by the rule of law rather than the authority of man flows from the 10 Commandments. Other Christian concepts like the dignity of labor, the existence of moral absolutes, fair trials with witnesses, and the importance of civil liberty are also crucial to our form of government and so easily taken for granted.
Wow, I'm sure thankful that I did not grow up as a child in the ancient world. However, I didn't know that women and child reforms were inspired by Jesus' teachings.
Yeah, Christians really took Jesus' teachings very seriously, and they applied them in real life. For example, though back then children were regarded as useless, Jesus valued them, and he said this about them: "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." Women were also looked down upon in Roman and Jewish culture at the time, such that a woman's testimony was not valid in court. But as we see from Jesus' encounters with people like the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4, and as well as the bleeding woman in Mark 5, Jesus really listens to and dignifies even the lowliest of women in Jewish culture at the time. And though we take these values for granted today because of Christianity, back then these values about the worth of children, women, and slaves were revolutionary in a culture that considered your life lesser if you fell into one of those categories. Going further along the list of influences, the video also talks about how checks and balances in the judicial system were born out of a Christian understanding of man's sinfulness. So even though the American system is by no means perfect, the existence of such checks and balances promotes fairness and justice. But there's even more, especially around the areas of education, science, and philanthropy as well. So let's watch another clip summarizing Christianity's impacts in those areas.
Jesus was a teacher and instructed his followers to teach. So Christians developed schools and later monasteries, laying the groundwork for modern education. Christians founded 106 of the first 108 universities in the U.S. Ideas like tax-supported public schools, kindergarten, grade levels, secondary schools, modern colleges and universities, education for the deaf and the blind, literacy for the masses, and universal education that reaches beyond class, gender, and ethnicity all have one thing in common. They are all products of Christianity. It's hard to imagine life without the technological advances of modern science. Science, as we know it today, emerged hundreds of years ago during a period of unprecedented advances in mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, and chemistry. The vast majority of these brilliant scientists, nearly every single one of them, were Christians. They believed that since the universe was created by a rational creator using rational rules, it ought to yield its secrets to rational creatures using reason and observation. As a result, these early scientists searched for natural laws, confident that they existed, and they found them. Jesus' concern for all who suffered went above and beyond the social order of his day. In 252 AD, the Christians of Corinth saved the city from a plague, risking their lives to help those who had been dragged out into the street and abandoned to die. Christian compassion for the poor and the sick led to institutions for lepers, and later monasteries dedicated to the care of the sick. These were the beginning of our modern hospitals. Christians were the driving force behind the creation of orphanages, care for the elderly, prison reform, labor reform, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and the YMCA. And charitable giving was a uniquely Christian innovation, giving rise to countless contemporary philanthropic organizations. Our modern-day conceptions of human rights and equality derive exclusively from the biblical idea found in Genesis that all people are created in the image of God. Expanding on this affirmation of human equality, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Now there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, male and female, but all are one in Christ Jesus." But what about the dark stains in the history books? The Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Salem witch hunts. Christians clearly affirm that all people are flawed, so it's no surprise that Christianity's track record, like everyone else's, is less than perfect. But notice, those who committed these acts were acting in direct contradiction to the teaching and life of Jesus. So clearly, the blame cannot be placed on Jesus, but on those whose actions oppose his teachings and way of life. So much of what is good in our lives came about because 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth turned the world upside down. The historical record is unmistakably clear. No other cultural influence, no other social movement, no other teaching, philosophy, or religion has done more to promote the well-being of more people than Christianity.
It's interesting how Christianity led to the development of higher education.
Yeah, I think so too. As many of you may know, many prestigious universities in the United States, including all the Ivy League universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, originally started out as schools for Christian ministers to preach the message of Christianity. And UC Berkeley has this influence as well, which you can see through the university's motto, Fiat Lux, which is Latin for "Let there be light," a reference to the opening pages of the Bible in the book of Genesis.
I see. And so we talked about, the good side of Christianity, but what about the bad and the ugly? The video also noted that there has been many stains in Christian history, like the Crusades and the Inquisition.
That's very true too. As the video mentioned, many people in history have committed wrongs in the name of Christ. However, there is a difference between wrongs done by people claiming to represent Christ and what Christianity actually teaches. Even Gandhi himself said, "I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike Christ." I think there are many modern examples of this happening as well. Even recently, this past month, there's a celebrity pastor at a megachurch called Hillsong who's been fired for cheating on his wife. And in recent history, many people have spoken out about child sexual abuse happening in the Catholic Church. A recent independent investigation into the Catholic Church reported that its neglect of the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of children and young people in favor of protecting its reputation was in conflict with its mission of love and care for the innocent and vulnerable. The Bible condemns these actions, along with all the terrible things done in the past by Christians that contradict the teachings of Jesus. My hope is that we can see how when Christianity is lived out accurately, it has made a tremendously positive impact on human history.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for me to help understand that difference too. And lastly, I was surprised by how Christians responded to the Black Plague when it hit Europe and Asia back in 1347. The European authorities did their best to prevent spreading by separating the sailors who were from Asia for a period of 40 days, or a quarantine. And even then, it couldn't be contained and people were avoiding the sick by all means. However, there were a number of Christians who voluntarily cared for these people with the Black Plague, even at the risk of exposure and the cost of their lives.
Wow, that really hits close to home today with this current pandemic. And it also reminds me of my good friend Dr. Jeff Chu. Jeff was born and raised in Taipei, graduated from UC Berkeley, and currently works as an emergency room surgeon, and he has some shifts at the Berkeley Tank Center as well. With the pandemic spread to the US around March, New York City was the hardest hit area, and hospitals were overwhelmed by COVID patients. Jeff signed up with a nonprofit Christian organization called Samaritan's Purse and flew out to help treat COVID patients at a field hospital in Central Park. Some people might judge him as crazy for doing that, especially early on in the pandemic. But to give you some insight into what he was thinking, this is what he wrote before flying out.
I still remember the sleepless nights as I wrestled with whether or not to even sign up to volunteer as a healthcare worker to help out in New York. I had so much fear, yet it couldn't be clearer to me that as a medical doctor, this was an opportunity to obey God. There was a need, and I had the skills to meet that need, so I should go. But I was afraid, so I prayed. I don't know where I'll be staying, what I will eat or drink or wear, what the field hospital will look like, what my medical duties will be. Will I have to put someone on the ventilator? Will I have to hold someone's hand as they pass? What if I die? A verse I memorized and held onto during this time was Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, where the Apostle Paul said, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Death was defeated by Jesus, so as a Christian, what did I have to fear? If I truly believe that this life is momentary and filled with suffering, and eternity is long and filled with joy in the presence of my Heavenly Father, then yes, to die is gain.
So this was back in April when the pandemic was at its worst in New York City. And I'm glad to say that Jeff did a lot of good work out there and has since returned safely.
Wow, I'm really glad to hear that. And it's incredible to hear how his faith in Christianity led him to such a compassionate and sacrificial response, even when confronted by his own fears and the dire needs of COVID. And just to zoom out a bit, I see how Jeff's response is yet another thread in the whole tapestry of Christians' influence throughout history. And Christmas is the holiday that commemorates the source of it all, the arrival of Jesus. So stay tuned for future segments as we talk more about Christmas. But that's it for today's Mentos, and we'll see you next time. Bye!